A veteran lost in the Smoky Mountains took refuge in an old wagon cabin as a violent storm swallowed the forest. Through the night, the cabin held its ground against the storm, refusing to give in as the winds hammered the walls. In the morning, he realized why what was inside had been waiting for over 100 years, and why he was the one meant to discover it. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support truly means the world to us. Cold morning mist drifted over the Smoky Mountains, as if the sky itself exhaled in sorrow. Michael Grant, 45, walked slowly along the narrow trail, his boots pressing into the damp earth with a tired rhythm. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp, angular jaw and a rough beard that grew uneven from days of neglect. His dark brown hair, streaked with early gray, fell messily across his temples, an unintentional reflection of the disarray in his heart. His hazel eyes, once kind and warm, now carried the muted dullness of someone who had stared too long at memories that hurt. A year ago, he had been gentle, patient, almost soft in his kindness. Losing his wife Anna and their 9-year-old son Samuel in a car accident had hollowed him out. Home became a grave of echoes. Wishes became blades. Every morning felt heavier than the last. Shadow, his black and white German shepherd, who had served with him in Afghanistan, was the only soul who kept him tethered to the world. Shadow walked beside him with steady, deliberate steps. The dog was 4 years old, powerful yet graceful, with a lean, muscular frame and amber eyes that captured everything: fear, hope, shifts in air, shifts in Michael. His coat, a striking contrast of black along his spine and bright white beneath, gave him a noble appearance, even when soaked in mist. Shadow was a soldier in his own right, trained in tracking, protection, and obedience, yet gentle enough to rest his head on Michael's lap during sleepless nights. This trail, quiet and predictable, was supposed to soothe them both. Michael had chosen it precisely because it offered nothing dramatic. He didn't want adventure. He wanted silence. Silence deep enough to quiet the constant static inside him. After months of living inside memories that tore at him, he longed for something steady, something ancient and strong enough to hold a man who felt as if he was dissolving. The forest around him felt ancient and indifferent, its branches bowing under the weight of morning moisture. Pale sunlight slipped through the canopy like broken shards of glass. Michael inhaled deeply, letting the cold air scrape against his lungs. For a heartbeat, he felt something shift inside, a fleeting sense of being held rather than haunted. His mind drifted toward Anna, her soft brown hair, her olive skin that warmed under sunlight, the way her laughter lifted gently at the end of each sentence. Samuel appeared next in his thoughts, small, curious, freckles scattered across his cheeks like constellations. Their absence gnawed at him. He felt carved open, emptied of warmth, reshaped by grief into a man unrecognizable even to himself. He walked deeper into the woods, not to heal, but simply to breathe without drowning. Shadow trotted ahead, glancing back often, as if making sure Michael hadn't disappeared into his pain. Then the sky shifted. Clouds swept across the horizon in a low, rolling wave, dark, dense, and far too fast for a normal mountain change. The wind rose, carrying a sharp, metallic chill. Michael stopped, brows furrowing. Weather in the Smokies often changed, but this carried the uneasy weight of something unnatural. Shadow stiffened, ears perked, body alert. "It's okay," Michael whispered, though uncertainty crawled through him. Rain arrived suddenly, vertical, slicing sheets that hammered the leaves and blurred the trail in seconds. Michael tightened the straps of his pack and squinted through the storm. The once clear markers vanished, swallowed by mud and flowing water. He turned back, but the forest behind him looked wrong. Shapes shifted, shadows stretched. What had been familiar minutes ago now appeared unfamiliar, rearranged by the storm's hand. "Not now," he muttered, wiping his face as frustration surged. He had come here to escape the collapse of his life, not fall into yet another one. But nature did not bargain with broken men. The rain washed away every clue, tracks, markings, even the faint impression of Shadow's paws. The forest floor became a restless mosaic of movement, water carving new paths that erased every old one. Panic brushed him, but the soldier inside, trained through war and trauma, forced steady breaths and clear thinking. Even so, beneath the discipline, grief stirred like an old bruise pressed too hard. He felt small again, helpless in a world that kept taking and taking until there was nothing left to mourn. The wind roared louder. Branches cracked in the distance. The trail split into false paths before dissolving entirely beneath fast-moving streams. Shadow barked, sharp and urgent, the sound slicing through the storm like a flare shot into the night. Michael spun slowly, scanning for anything familiar. Nothing matched his memory. Nothing felt safe. And then the truth fell over him like the rain itself, cold, heavy, merciless. He was lost. Lost in the storm. Lost in the mountains. Lost in the wreckage of a life that no longer had shape. Shadow pressed close to his leg, trembling yet resolute, reminding him he wasn't completely alone. Michael swallowed, lifted his chin against the rain, and forced himself to move, searching for shelter, for direction, for anything that might keep the darkness from swallowing them whole. The rain hammered downward with a relentless metallic hiss as Michael pushed through the undergrowth, his breath tight and uneven beneath the storm's pressure. Shadow trotted beside him, water streaming from his black and white coat, but the dog's movements remained sharp and alert. The world had shrunk to shifting shadows and the roar of wind, until Shadow suddenly froze. His ears shot upward, his muscles coiled, and then he barked with a force that cut clean through the storm. Before Michael could respond, the dog gripped the cuff of his wet flannel sleeve and tugged hard, pulling him toward a darker mass among the trees. At first, Michael thought it was a fallen trunk, but the shape held edges no tree could form. As they approached, the outline sharpened. Tall wooden walls, seams of aged planks, and the curved remnants of wagon wheels, half swallowed by earth and moss. The structure rose from the forest floor like a relic exhumed by wind and memory. A cabin, small, weather-stained, unmistakably human, had been built around an old frontier wagon, its frame reinforced by thick beams that had resisted decades of storms. Even through sheets of rain, the workmanship was clear and strangely deliberate, as if crafted by hands that believed their shelter must endure long after they themselves were gone. Michael stared, stunned. There was something ghost-like in its stillness, something reverent in the way the forest bowed around it. He stepped closer, brushing wet branches aside, inspecting the wagon wheels half buried beneath roots as thick as ropes. Whoever had built this had known survival, patience, and the stubborn will to remain. The storm screamed around them, but the cabin stood unmoved, its roof angled expertly to deflect runoff, its door shut tight against the world. Shadow paced near the entrance, tail low but wagging softly, as though sensing safety where Michael sensed mystery. His instincts had led them here, just as they had once guided Michael through the smoke and chaos of battlefields. Michael touched the cabin wall. The wood felt cold but solid under his palm. He imagined a family sheltering here long ago, clinging to hope with the same desperation he carried now. Lightning flashed, illuminating the clearing for a fraction of a heartbeat, and in that instant the cabin looked almost alive, like a creature curled against centuries of storm. Meanwhile, miles downhill, Ranger Emily Carter was riding out the storm inside her patrol truck, scanning the forest edge for signs of trail damage. Emily was 32, tall and lean, with a ponytail of auburn hair soaked through the back of her jacket. Freckles dusted her fair skin, and her green eyes carried the steady, assessing calm of someone who had grown up in these mountains. She had a reputation among hikers as warm and helpful, but among rangers as stubborn and unyielding, traits forged after losing her younger brother in a flash flood when she was 19. Since then, storms never felt like weather to her. They felt like warnings. When her radio crackled with news of rapid trail erosion, she tightened her grip on the wheel, her jaw clenched with instinctive worry. She stepped out into the rain, scanning the muddy ground, and immediately spotted what she feared. Deep ruts washed out by water, fresh branches snapped by force. Not nature's randomness, but signs of a person caught where they shouldn't be. And then she saw it. Prints. Not just boots, but the distinctive paw marks of a large dog. Back in the clearing, Michael weighed his options. The storm was worsening, the forest shifting into something hostile and unpredictable. He could either remain exposed or trust the strange sanctuary rising before him. Shadow pressed against his leg, urging him toward the door. The dog's amber eyes gleamed with certainty, not fear. Michael knelt briefly, gripping Shadow's soaked fur. "All right, boy," he murmured. "Lead the way." He pushed at the heavy wooden door. To his surprise, it did not resist. It opened with a slow, aching groan, as if it had been waiting years for someone to return. A warm breath of musty but dry air drifted out. Michael stepped inside, with Shadow at his heels, leaving the storm raging behind them. The cabin greeted Michael with a darkness that felt older than the storm outside. Yet it was dry, miraculously dry, as if time itself had wrapped the place in a protective shell. The air smelled of dust, old pine, and faint ash. Shadow shook off rainwater, spraying droplets across the wooden floor before lowering his head to sniff the room with focused intent. Michael closed the door behind them, shutting out the roar of the storm, and blinked until the dim shapes inside sharpened. Along the left wall stood a narrow built-in bench, its edges worn smooth from long use. Opposite it, a folded wooden cot leaned against the wall, secured by a rusted hook. Near the center stood a compact iron stove, small but sturdy, its chimney pipe disappearing upward through a precisely carved opening in the ceiling. The stove was cold, silent, almost patient in its stillness. Dust coated the metal surface, dulling its once dark sheen, but its seams were tightly joined, a piece of frontier craftsmanship designed not for comfort but for survival. Michael ran his fingers across it, feeling the rough texture beneath his calloused skin. Whoever had built this place had done so with intention. Shadow's claws clicked softly on the floorboards as he circled near the stove, ears twitching. The dog's amber eyes swept the room as though assessing threats. Old instincts died hard in a former military working dog. Michael crouched and spoke quietly. "Easy, boy. We're safe here." The words were meant for himself as much as for Shadow. He moved to the corner where a small stack of kindling rested beneath a low shelf. Beside it hung a set of iron tools, poker, brush, tongs, all aged but functional. Above the shelf, faint carvings covered a panel of wood, lines, arrows, symbols etched by a careful hand long ago. Michael paused. The carvings were too deliberate to be random, but their meaning was unclear. He set the thought aside and began arranging the kindling in the stove, striking a spark with a metal lighter he carried. The flame caught, then struggled, then dimmed to a stubborn flicker. Within seconds, smoke spilled backward, pouring into the room instead of rising through the chimney. It burned his eyes and scraped his throat, forcing him to cough and wave his hand frantically. Shadow barked sharply and ran toward the back wall, sniffing at a panel where the carvings were deepest. The dog looked back at Michael, whining as though urging him to follow. Michael wiped his watering eyes and stepped closer. By lifting the lantern he carried, he caught the faint shape of words, letters etched over a century ago. The handwriting was rough but legible. Wind from east, lower vent. Heavy storms, close upper half. Michael felt a strange shiver run through him. These were instructions, guidance from someone long gone, someone who had battled storms of their own. He located the vents along the chimney pipe, small iron openings nearly invisible in the dim light, and adjusted them according to the carved notes. He returned to the stove, struck the lighter again, and this time the flame blossomed more confidently. Smoke rose, hesitated, then drew upward into the chimney with a relieved sigh, as though the cabin itself exhaled. Within moments, orange light filled the center of the room, flickering against the wooden walls and pushing shadows into gentle retreat. Warmth followed, slow at first, then steady enough to thaw the chill in Michael's bones. He sank onto the bench, elbows on his knees, watching the fire reflect in Shadow's eyes. Something softened inside him, something he had not felt since the night before the accident, a fragile sense of being held, not by another person, but by a place that had survived loneliness longer than he ever had. Meanwhile, depths below the trail, Emily Carter moved through the storm like someone who had learned to decipher danger from instinct alone. Rain plastered her auburn hair to her cheeks as she swept her flashlight across the ravaged ground. She crouched suddenly, freckles standing stark on her pale skin, when she spotted a scrap of fabric caught on a broken branch. It was dark red, torn unevenly, soaked, but unmistakably part of a flannel shirt. "Damn," she whispered, her breath fogging in the cold air. Someone was out here. Someone who didn't stand a chance without shelter. She tucked the fabric into her jacket pocket and pushed deeper into the forest, the storm swirling around her like a warning she refused to obey. Inside the cabin, Michael watched the fire bloom into steady, rhythmic life, illuminating fragments of memories he had spent months trying to outrun. As the storm raged outside, the small flame painted the room in warm shades of gold, waking a sense of belonging he had long forgotten. For the first time in a long while, he felt the faintest shift inside him, like a door opening, like a healing that had not yet begun, but now had room to try. The fire cast a soft amber glow across the cabin, warming the cold corners and revealing details Michael hadn't noticed before. Now that the storm's fury was muted by thick wooden walls, the silence inside felt almost sacred. Shadow lay curled near the stove, his black and white coat shimmering in the flickering light, but his ears twitched at every subtle creak, as though he sensed the room carried more than just dust and time. Michael set his pack aside and explored the shelves lining the far wall. They held nothing modern, only a few rusted hinges, a tin cup, and a folded piece of cloth discolored by age. He lifted it gently and uncovered a stack of yellowed pages tied with twine. The paper was brittle, edges curled, the ink faded but not erased. As he untied the twine, a faint smell of old smoke and pine rose from the pages, like the lingering breath of someone who had written them by lamplight long ago. The handwriting was steady, slanted slightly to the right, the penmanship of someone accustomed to careful work. The signature appeared at the bottom of the first page. Elias Turner. Michael imagined him instantly, a frontier settler, perhaps mid-30s, lean from labor, sun-browned skin, dark hair tied back, and eyes shaped by equal parts hardship and hope. Elias wasn't a man who complained. His writing reflected quiet resilience. He wrote of traveling west with his wife, Margaret, a small, pale woman with soft features and a fragile constitution, and their 2 young children, Thomas, 8 years old, slender and curious, and baby Eliza, barely walking. Their journey had been long and raw, dwindling food supplies, early frost, and Margaret's worsening cough, a sickness that clung to her lungs as winter pressed in. The family had made the painful decision to stop their westward migration and settle where the forest offered what little protection it could. Elias described how he dismantled their wagon and rebuilt it into a stationary cabin, reinforcing the walls with timber from the surrounding woods, shaping a home from necessity rather than choice. Michael read in silence, feeling something tight and familiar rise in his chest, grief recognizing grief across a century. Shadow suddenly stepped forward, nose low, tail stiff. He sniffed along the floorboards near the bench, lingering at one plank more than the others. Michael frowned, knelt, and pressed his fingers along the edge. The board shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Hard thudding, he wedged his fingertips beneath it and lifted carefully. A small cavity lay beneath, dry and perfectly concealed. Inside were items wrapped in linen so aged it disintegrated at the edges. Michael unwrapped each piece slowly. The first was a cracked leather wallet containing a few coins and a hand-drawn sketch of Margaret, her delicate face rendered in rushed pencil strokes. Next came 2 silver wedding rings, tarnished but still beautiful. Then a small velvet pouch containing a modest but finely crafted brooch and a pair of earrings, Margaret's, perhaps passed down from her own mother. Finally, folded with deliberate precision, was a map. Elias's map. It showed the territory he hoped to claim once his family had the strength to travel again, a promise trapped in ink, never fulfilled. For several moments, Michael sat motionless. The weight of Elias's story pressed on him, the fear of losing a wife, the desperation to protect children, the stubborn fight against nature's cruelty. It mirrored his own ache so closely he felt his throat tighten. These weren't relics. They were pieces of a life abruptly halted, a family's hope buried beneath a floorboard where no one was meant to find them unless fate intervened. Shadow nudged his shoulder gently, sensing the shift in Michael's breathing. Far away from the cabin, Emily Carter pushed deeper into the storm-slick forest. Her flashlight beam trembled as she stepped over fallen branches and mud ridges. Suddenly, she spotted something new. Clear paw prints, large, distinct, cut through the softened earth. Her pulse quickened. "A dog," she whispered, relief and urgency blending. Someone out here had a companion, which meant whoever was lost might be moving faster or searching desperately for shelter. She straightened, rain dripping from her auburn hair, and continued through the ravaged trail, now certain she wasn't alone in this search. Back inside, Michael placed the rings and jewelry back into the cavity, along with the map, his movements respectful, almost reverent. He kept the letters in his lap, unwilling to return them to the dark just yet. As the fire crackled softly and the storm roared outside, he felt an unexpected warmth settle inside him, a sense of connection to someone who had fought the same kind of battles he had, someone who had loved fiercely and lost more than the world ever recorded. And in that quiet, fragile moment, Michael understood. In this hidden cabin, history had not died, but waited for a hand willing to lift it from silence. The storm returned with a fury that felt almost deliberate, as if the mountains had taken a deep breath, only to exhale their full rage upon the tiny cabin. Michael felt the tremors first, a low groaning through the floorboards, followed by a violent shudder that rattled the iron stove and sent dust drifting from the rafters. Shadow rose instantly, the fur along his spine bristling. His amber eyes shone in the firelight, wide and alert. Outside, wind slammed against the walls in brutal waves, each gust howling like something wounded or angry. Michael moved quickly, grabbing an old timber beam leaning in the corner, a sturdy piece of wood darkened by age. He wedged it across the doorframe, shoulders straining as he forced it into place. The cabin creaked, but held, its joints tightened by a century of storms and survival. Shadow pressed close to his leg, trembling not in fear, but in instinctive readiness, trained to guard, to endure, to wait for whatever came next. When the beam finally locked into position, Michael's breath came out rough. He wiped sweat and rain from his brow and returned to the bench where he had laid Elias Turner's final letters. The pages trembled in his hand, as if the storm itself wanted to snatch them away. Lighting a small lantern beside the fire, he leaned forward and continued reading. Elias's writing had changed in these last entries, still careful but weighted with exhaustion. He wrote of Margaret's worsening illness, of Thomas's attempts to keep the fire alive, of baby Eliza's cries softening into silence as winter tightened its grip. The words painted a picture not of surrender, but of a man carving hope into each freezing day. Then came the final passage, written in ink that had faded into a pale ghost of itself. If anyone finds this place, carry our story into the light, so winter does not take from us again. Michael lowered the page slowly, his jaw tightening. The words struck him with painful clarity. Here was another man who had tried to protect his family against a world that took too much and offered too little. Another man who had lost the people he loved to forces beyond his control. But unlike Elias, Michael had survived alone, and survival had felt more like punishment than mercy. He stared into the fire, its warmth unable to reach the deepest part of him. Should he keep Elias's hidden treasures? The rings, the jewelry, the map? They could be worth something, but they were not just valuables. They were intentions, promises, fragments of a family who had fought until they could fight no more. A weight pressed onto his chest, heavy as grief, but shaped like duty. Shadow placed his head gently on Michael's knee. The gesture, it was small, yet grounding, as if urging Michael to choose the path that healed, not the one that merely filled another empty space. Meanwhile, far beyond the glow of the cabin, Ranger Emily Carter pushed through the storm-forged forest. Her boots sank into mud with each step, leaving deep prints alongside the paw marks she followed. Her soaked auburn hair clung to her face, but her green eyes stayed sharp beneath her hood. She was exhausted, chilled to the bone, but resolute, driven by the same stubborn instinct that had guided her since losing her brother years ago. She wasn't going to let another life vanish into a storm. When she found the next set of tracks, Shadow's prints, clearer now, her heart kicked with renewed urgency. "You're close," she whispered into the wind, certain the storm had pushed her and the lost hiker into the same inevitable path. Back inside the cabin, Michael folded Elias's final page and held it to his chest for a long moment. The fire cracked softly, as though acknowledging the weight of the choice forming inside him, one that would shape not just his fate, but the legacy of a family long gone. As the storm battered the wooden walls, Michael finally understood. The cabin had sheltered him, but it had also asked something of him. And the night was far from over. The storm faded into a heavy silence by dawn, leaving the forest looking as though it had survived a war of its own. Michael stepped outside the cabin cautiously, his boots sinking into mud softened by a night of relentless rain. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of broken pine and overturned earth. All around him, fallen trees lay sprawled like giant bodies, their roots exposed and raw. Branches littered the ground in tangled heaps. Every direction he looked, the landscape appeared violently rearranged, familiar pathways erased, new hazards born from destruction. Shadow followed close, his fur still damp but his gait alert, as if ready for either danger or escape. Michael scanned the shattered terrain, searching for any opening through the maze of debris. But every route out was blocked. Massive trunks wedged against each other, slopes washed out, ravines deepened by rushing water. He tried pushing through a narrow gap between two fallen trees, only to realize the ground beneath was unstable, the mud threatening to swallow his boots with each step. Shadow barked sharply, urging him back. Michael returned to the cabin with a heavy exhale, feeling the weight of helplessness settle on his shoulders again. He couldn't leave. Not yet, not without risking both their lives. As he stood near the threshold, uncertain of his next move, Shadow suddenly stiffened. His ears shot forward, tail raised, muscles twitching with alertness. Then he barked, a deep, resonant warning that echoed across the clearing. Michael tensed. Shadow rarely barked without reason. The dog bolted toward the doorway, claws scraping wood as he planted himself, eyes fixed on the forest's edge. Michael grabbed his pack, instinctively prepared for anything. A figure emerged between the broken trees, first a silhouette, then the unmistakable shape of a woman pushing through branches with determined force. Emily Carter stepped into view, breathing hard but steady. Her auburn hair clung to her face, strands tangled from the storm. Mud streaked her jacket and pants, and her cheeks were flushed from cold and exertion. Even exhausted, she held herself with the kind of resolve built from years of refusing to give up. Tall, lean, and sharp-eyed, with a posture that said danger didn't frighten her, it focused her. "You're a hard man to track," she called out, voice slightly hoarse but steady. She approached carefully, one hand raised in a friendly gesture as Shadow continued to bark, more out of excitement than threat. "Saw the prints," she continued. "Boots. Dog. Figured someone had to be alive out here." Michael felt a flood of relief wash through him, loosening something that had been wound tight since the storm began. He nodded, his voice rough. "Didn't think anyone would come looking." Emily gave a faint breath of a smile, brief but genuine. "Storm like that? Someone always needs help." She assessed the forest quickly, her green eyes sweeping over fallen trunks and unstable slopes. "There's a way out," she said, pointing toward a newly opened corridor where the storm had uprooted several trees in the same direction. "It's messy, but it leads to a service trail. Stay close and watch your footing." Michael grabbed the bundle of letters, the folded map, and the wrapped heirlooms from the Turner family and secured them in his pack. Shadow nudged him forward eagerly as Emily led the way. The path was rough, carved not by intention, but by destruction. They stepped over splintered branches, climbed over slick bark, and maneuvered through narrow spaces shaped by fallen giants. The forest slowly thinned, the air clearing as the roar of civilization grew faint but present. When they reached the edge of an old service road, Michael finally felt the knot in his chest loosen. They were no longer lost. And as he walked beside Emily and Shadow, carrying a century-old story in his pack, he realized he wasn't walking back to life alone. Something was guiding him forward, just as the forest had guided him to the cabin the night before. The Tennessee Historical Museum sat at the edge of the city like an old guardian, brick walls warmed by morning sunlight, tall windows reflecting a sky finally clear after days of storm. Michael walked toward its entrance with Shadow at his side, the dog's black and white fur still carrying traces of pine and mountain wind. Michael's steps were steady but hesitant, the weight of the Turner family's letters, map, and heirloom bundle resting heavily in his pack, not because they burdened him, but because they felt sacred. His face, sharp-boned, tired, and weathered, looked different in daylight now. The grief carved into him had softened, replaced by something cautious but alive. Shadow nudged his knee as they approached the front desk, as if reminding him that this journey wasn't about loss anymore. At the reception counter stood Dr. Harold Whitmore, a museum historian in his late 50s. He was tall and slender, with silver hair combed neatly back and spectacles balanced on a narrow nose. His demeanor, gentle, meticulous, and quietly curious, belonged to a man who had spent his life listening to stories preserved in dust. He greeted Michael with a handshake that was surprisingly warm. "You're the one who contacted us about the wagon structure?" He asked it carefully, like he already sensed there was more beneath the words. When Michael placed the Turner papers and artifacts onto the counter, Whitmore's eyes widened with reverence. He handled each item like a fragile miracle. "This," he whispered, isn't just history. It's a survival blueprint, a forgotten chapter of frontier engineering. Within hours, a team assembled, curators, engineers, archivists, all drawn by the magnitude of what Michael had brought. Shadow, lying obediently at Michael's feet, watched with proud alertness as gloved hands examined drawings, maps, and faded ink that had survived a century of winters. When Whitmore asked if Michael could guide them back to the site for recovery, the answer was an immediate yes. Days later, Michael walked again through the Smoky Mountains, but not as a lost man searching for a way out. He walked beside professionals who trusted his memory, his instincts, and the quiet authority he carried. Emily was among them, her auburn hair tied back now, her ranger uniform clean, but her eyes still bearing that mix of strength and softness. She gave him a small smile when he arrived, one that carried gratitude and something unspoken. Together they watched the rescue crew stabilize the ancient wagon cabin, lifting it with precision instead of force. For a moment, Michael thought he could feel Elias Turner there with them, standing in the wind, watching his home rise again after a century of silence. Weeks passed, and the museum unveiled the restored structure in a dedicated exhibit. The wagon cabin stood beneath warm lights, its wooden beams preserved, its iron stove burnished gently but left untouched. Beside it, framed behind glass, were Elias's letters, his family's names, their sorrow, their survival. Visitors moved through the room in respectful quiet. Children stared wide-eyed. Adults traced the carvings with their gaze. On a small plaque near the front, 2 names were written as part of the rescue effort. Michael Heron, civilian contributor. Shadow, hero dog. Michael stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets, unsure how he had become a bridge between centuries. Emily stepped beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. "You brought them into the light," she murmured. "You saved more than a cabin." Michael swallowed, the truth of it settling deep. He hadn't gone into the mountains to be found. But something ancient had found him anyway, pulled him out of the wreckage of grief, handed him a purpose, and reminded him how to feel warmth again. Shadow leaned against his leg, content, and for the first time in a long time, Michael let himself believe in beginnings. Sometimes God sends miracles quietly, through a stranger, a loyal dog, or a forgotten house that leads a wounded heart back to hope. If this story touched you, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe. May God bless everyone watching with protection, comfort, and light on every path ahead.